Welcome to Environmental Law Explored, a podcast series, the podcast of the American Bar Association section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. SEER is a member organization whose mission is to foster the success of a diverse community of environmental, energy, and resources lawyers, advisors, law students, and decision makers, and provide a premier forum for the exchange of ideas and information.
Welcome to this podcast from the American Bar Association's section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. I'm Michael Gerrard. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School, where I teach courses on environmental, energy, and climate change law, and I'm the founder and faculty director of the Sabin Center for Climate Change Law. This podcast series is based on the third edition of the book Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, edited by Jody Freeman, Michael Berger, and myself from ABA Publishing. The first edition was published in 2007, the second in 2014, and the third in 2023. Things have changed considerably between each edition. This book remains the only comprehensive treatment of the U.S. law and climate change. Today, I'm happy to be speaking with the authors of two of the chapters of the book. Tracy Hester wrote the chapter about carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal. Tracy teaches environmental law at the University of Houston Law Center, where he co-directs the Law Center's Environment, Energy, and Natural Resources Law Center and the University of Houston Center for Carbon Management in Energy. Tracy's the president-elect of the American College of Environmental Lawyers and an elected member of the American Law Institute. Prior to moving to academia, Tracy practiced law for 25 years and served as a partner at Bracewell LLP for 16 years. Peter Lehner, together with Nathan Rosenberg and Carrie Apfel, wrote the chapter about agriculture for the book. Peter directs the Sustainable Food and Farming Program at Earthjustice, where he develops litigation, administrative, and legislative strategies to promote a more just and environmentally sound agricultural system. From 2007 to 2015, Peter was the executive director of the Natural Resources Defense Council, and for the 8 years before that, he was chief of the Environmental Protection Bureau of the New York State Attorney General's office. He also teaches a seminar on food systems and environmental law at Columbia and Yale Law Schools. Welcome, Tracy and Peter. Tracy, my first question is to you. Carbon capture and sequestration and carbon removal are two different things. Can you explain what they are and what is the difference between the two?
Sure, Mike. And first of all, thank you for bringing us all together. It's always a pleasure to talk with both you and Peter. The difference is one captures at the source, the other captures from the ambient atmosphere. So carbon capture and sequestration, just imagine that what you're actually focused on is the CO2 that is being emitted from a production process or operation. So at a refinery, at a power plant, at a chemical manufacturing facility, the idea is to keep that CO2 from getting into the atmosphere in the first place and then managing it as it's being captured. Carbon dioxide removal is different in the sense that the gas is already out. It's focused on ambient air levels of carbon dioxide. So as a result, it has a different set of technical challenges. You're trying to essentially remove very low levels in absolute terms of CO2 from the air around us, which is oftentimes difficult to capture without huge amounts of energy or technological commitments. It also, though, allows us to tackle a different type of problem, which is bringing down the accumulated amounts of CO2 in our atmosphere that have been building up since the expansion of industrial activities and the Industrial Revolution.
Very good. So starting just with carbon capture at sources like power plants, in very broad terms, what sorts of laws either require or incentivize carbon capture?
Well, one requires, one entices. So the requirements are sets of federal environmental laws that focus on emission limitations, predominantly under the Clean Air Act. So depending on what sector you're in, there are different types of air emission requirements that certain types of facilities must meet. The ones that get the most attention because they produce the most CO2 are power generation and refining and other heavy industrial activities. Recently, the Biden administration has released new rules that specifically set emission limits for both existing coal-fired power plants as well as new natural gas-fired power plants that will require essentially installation of carbon capture or sequestration type technologies or something as good for those types of operations. So essentially, thou shalt. In contrast, there's also a separate set of incentives where you can actually get credits for the amount of CO2 that you capture and sequester. So for, again, carbon capture and sequestration under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, we actually have certain amounts of money that go per ton of CO2 captured that can range around $65 per ton and upwards. It depends, again, what sort of capture you're doing and what type of Internal Revenue Service guidance requirements apply to you. But essentially, it's the carrot as opposed to the emissions limitation stick.
So that's the 45Q program, as it's called?
Exactly.
With respect to the regulations that you mentioned that the Biden administration has issued, what's their current status?
Current status is they have been released in final form. The Biden administration has essentially said that they are going to, in the future, release additional regulations that will deal with other types of power plants. But essentially, we are waiting for the starting gun on litigation when those rules actually get published in the Federal Register and become amenable to lawsuits. But unless we see some form of stay from the courts, those rules are going to be binding and in effect.
And so, as you said, they apply to existing coal-fired power plants and to new natural gas plants. Do we have any idea when there might be regulations like that applying to existing natural gas plants? There are a lot of existing natural gas plants, and so it would be very consequential to require them to install carbon capture.
Absolutely, especially since we've been seeing an ongoing pivot from coal-fired power plants to natural gas for economic reasons, let aside legal compulsions. The short answer, though, is that the Biden administration has announced they intend to work on those rules, but given political realities, we're unlikely to see those rules get published in final form, and certainly in any kind of binding fashion, until after the election later this year. We're already bumping up against a window of reviewability for any final rules that get promulgated under the Congressional Review Act, which would make it problematic for any major new rule that the Biden administration releases that targets existing natural gas plants that might be subject to review under a new Congress, and especially if the White House changes hands.
Right. Obviously, if the White House changes hands, then a lot of this is going to go away one way or another.
If the White House changes hands, all bets are off.
Right. So we've been talking about carbon capture from sources. Now, moving to carbon dioxide removal from the ambient air, what sorts of laws regulate that?
Well, that's an interesting question because most of our environmental laws, including the Federal Clean Air Act, target the concept of emissions, the release of pollutants into the air and preventing them from being released in the first place. There's not a similar type of comprehensive regulatory framework on removing gases from the atmosphere. And typically, under most regimes of property ownership, gases you capture from the air are basically yours once you capture them. And there's not a comprehensive framework that dictates the amount of gas you withdraw or how you manage it. So it really turns on how you do it and the specific quirks of the kinds of pollutants that are generated by your process and where it's being done. So as a result, if you have a certain type of carbon removal plant that's located in one state that produces a certain kind of pollutant from its chemical scrubbing process, you may need all sorts of permits or federal overview if it uses federal permits or federal monies. The same type of plant located across a state line or using slightly different processes may have virtually no type of mandatory oversight. So it's a bit more ad hoc, and I think that's going to lead to some questions about how oversight of these processes can take place, either through those compulsory systems we've talked about, or alternatively as parts of conditions for receiving grant money from the Inflation Reduction Act or other federal sources.
The only thing I'd add to that is that many companies have made net zero pledges. They're pledging that going forward, some future year, maybe 2050, they're going to have net zero emissions. But since very few companies will have zero emissions, the only way they get to net zero emissions is by removing a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And a number of countries are making claims that they're doing that, but some of those claims have been called into question. And we're beginning to see the emergence of some regulatory requirements for fuller transparency and disclosure about those kinds of pledges.
Absolutely. And to the extent that the commercial devices, the commercial instruments that are sold, the credits, as part of the carbon removal process, there is oversight on the accuracy and the financial stability of those instruments. And you're exactly correct. The concerns about greenwashing and essentially providing, I hate to put it this way, credits of questionable validity would certainly be an issue that would have regulatory oversight.
Right, and there's a brand new California statute that requires a great deal of disclosure about these voluntary carbon offset programs, a lot of which rely on carbon dioxide removal of one sort or another. So if you're once you've removed the carbon, either at the plant through carbon capture and sequestration, or from the ambient air, you need to do something with the carbon, typically sequestering it. What laws apply to that, to carbon sequestration?
Well, it depends how you're sequestering it. So there are some ways to deal with CO2 that basically use the CO2. So in theory, for example, captured CO2 could be used in different types of production processes or actually be sold at sufficient purity as an industrial product itself. Some uses, for example, also include converting that CO2 into a fuel source, and essentially what might be called zero carbon fuel, although that's a bit of a misnomer. There's different regulatory requirements that apply to each of those kinds of uses, depending on what they are. For example, if you're using CO2 as a pharmaceutical grade instrument or using it for food, different requirements apply. But those are really, frankly, marginal cases. The vast bulk of expected management of CO2 that's captured, particularly from carbon dioxide removal, is sequestration. That essentially means geologic sequestration, which essentially means injection underground. That process under federal law is currently overseen with the Safe Drinking Water Act Underground Injection Control Program. And we have an entire category of wells called Class 6 wells that are specifically regulated with the idea that they are going to permanently sequester CO2 at a depth where it cannot pose any risk to drinking water sources or to ground level environmental receptors. There are other types of sequestration, for example, that might involve marine sequestration, which are still in development and being actively explored. But I think the baseline case right now is that most of them are going to go down wells. Now, I said federal oversight, like any environmental programs, we're going to see a delegation process. And as a result, some states are essentially taking over this injection well programs from the federal government, which means we'll start seeing some local variations in how they administer those programs, even though all of them will need to meet federal baseline requirements. In particular, for example, Louisiana recently took over its Class 6 well program, and we understand that Texas is not far behind them.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that much or most of the carbon dioxide has been captured for sequestration. It's actually going to a process called enhanced oil recovery, where it's injected at high pressure into oil or natural gas deposits that have been incompletely exploited. And the CO2 is used to basically squeeze the remaining oil and gas out of that formation. And so there are obviously a lot of questions about, is that really removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or are you pulling out more fossil fuels than you otherwise would pull out?
No, and that's an important clarification. Previously, there has not been an economic use for the CO2 that would compensate people who remove it or capture it. So for decades, CO2, ironically enough, from natural sources and basically geologic formations, has been injected underground to essentially enhance oil recovery. The model right now, aggressively being pursued in particular by Oxy and a handful of other companies, is to use captured CO2 for exactly the same purpose. That does affect what sort of credits you can get for the CO2 you capture and reuse in that way. It also raises different regulatory frameworks on how those wells are regulated. And the expectation, I think, is that as we continue to shoot for national reduction goals on CO2 emissions, that frankly, we're going to see the geologic sequestration of CO2 for straight sequestration purposes without enhanced recovery will grow. But that transition is going to take time.
Thank you. I have some questions I'd like to pose to Peter. Since we've just been talking about removing carbon from the atmosphere, can you talk to us about what is or could be the role of agriculture in removing carbon from the atmosphere?
I will start as Tracy did by saying thank you for having us, and it's a pleasure to be with both of you. Of course, plants absorb carbon, drawing it down from the atmosphere and incorporating it into the structure of the plant. And all plants do this, both those grown for agriculture or those in native settings like forests or elsewhere. In addition, healthy soils also contain and store a lot of carbon, so that native areas, untouched areas such as forest or native natural grasslands, are all the time sequestering carbon. And there's many opportunities then to change agriculture and forestry to sequester more carbon from the atmosphere. Different agricultural practices can make a difference, such as no-till, disturbing the ground less, winter cover crops, crop rotations. All of that can help the agricultural cropland store more carbon in those actively cultivated soils. Landowners can also plant more perennials. Those are trees or shrubs that grow from year to year and therefore have much bigger and deeper roots that store a lot more carbon. Trees are especially good at pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in their trunks and other material. So producers can plant trees around or in between rows of crops or around their fields or on buffer zones around streams and also in grazing land. So all of these are opportunities to add trees or change practices on actively managed cropland or grazing land to pull more carbon from the atmosphere. But frankly, only so much can be done without changing the use of the land. And right now, we're using land in tremendously inefficient ways. Land that could be used to sequester a lot more carbon. So for example, we use about 60 million acres of land for corn and soy to be made into biofuel. That's about the equivalent of Iowa and Indiana combined. But we could get the same transportation energy of those 60 million acres out of 200,000 acres of solar panels, leaving about 59.8 million acres left over to better sequester carbon. And doing something like that could be much more profitable for landowners if we had the right incentives. Right now, we incentivize corn production and pay virtually nothing for carbon sequestration. Another example, we use about 700 million acres. That's about 1/3 of the entire United States, contiguous United States, to graze cattle, even though we get only a tiny portion of our nutrition from beef. This is extremely inefficient. And much of that land is degraded and could sequester a lot more carbon if it were not overgrazed and if it were left to regenerate. So freeing up some of that land could also create an opportunity to remove a tremendous amount of carbon. So you can store carbon by either changing agricultural practices on actively managed land, but also we should look at what we're doing with the land and perhaps shift the land use more significantly. I will add that this is very real and very possible. I helped manage a coffee farm, which was one of the first to be truly carbon neutral. And we achieved that because we created riparian buffer zones and planted tens of thousands of shade trees that sequester a lot more carbon than our operations emit. And this also adds tremendous water quality and habitat benefits. And as the climate warms, the trees actually provide some important shade. So this carbon sequestration benefit in agriculture can also have other benefits for landowners and producers.
I've visited that coffee farm. It's a wonderful place.
And in part because of those shade trees.
That's right. What are the legal tools that could either require or incentivize the sorts of activities you were just talking about?
Well, there's really very few legal tools to require this, although some states and programs may require, for example, riparian buffers, a little undeveloped areas around streams. That's usually done for water quality protection, but it can help provide more carbon sequestration. So without requiring it, though, there are some ways that this can be encouraged. And the main way is for the federal government and some states to pay farmers to implement practices that are better at storing carbon. Of course, if we had a price on carbon overall and landowners could get paid for storing carbon through a larger market, that would be a possibility, but we don't have that right now. So right now we have to look at specific programs that pay farmers to implement carbon storing practices, and the main vehicle for that is the Farm Bill. But there's also other interest. For example, in consumer-facing companies may want to pay the farmers in their supply chain to implement these carbon-friendly practices so they can then go to consumers and say, hey, our cereal or whatever was grown in a more climate-friendly way. And then lastly, we have those not in the chain, companies, say an airline, that wants to pay farmers for implementing these carbon-friendly practices to supposedly offset their fossil emissions. You mentioned that a little bit earlier. There are a lot of challenges with the credibility and the monitoring and the oversight and the permanence and the additionality of these carbon offsets, particularly in agriculture, when they're offsetting fossil emissions. But that's certainly a growing interest. So you have government support and private sector support that could help pay farmers to implement these practices or potentially change the use of their land.
So we've been talking about agricultural activities that can absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, but there are also a lot of agricultural activities that put greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because too many people, I think, look at agriculture only as a source of removing carbon that somebody else put there. But in fact, agriculture contributes about a third of climate change emissions. That is well established, or the food system as a whole and agriculture itself is maybe about a quarter of all climate emissions. So this sector has a big job to reduce its own emissions, let alone help offset the emissions of other sectors. But where do these emissions come from? Some of it is burning fossil fuels for farm energy, tractors and ventilation fans and irrigation pumps and the like. But most of it comes from releases of nitrous oxide from land and releases of methane from manure management in cows. Over-fertilized land, and on average, farmers apply about twice as much fertilizer as the plants can use, release excess nitrogen, either as water pollution, which many people have heard about, or as nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas about 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And meanwhile, decomposing manure releases methane, a greenhouse gas about 80 times stronger than carbon dioxide over 20 years. And perhaps the aspect that most people don't know anything about is that cows belch methane continuously because their guts are different than ours. And in fact, cow belching methane is a larger source of methane in the United States than the gas sector. So we think of the big oil and gas sector as a big source of methane, but cows are actually a bigger source. Those are the main sources. I often summarize agricultural greenhouse gas emissions as coming from cows, corn, and crap.
So we have a lot of emissions coming from the agricultural sector. What changes in the law could lead to significant reductions in those greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector?
Well, looking at agriculture like another industry, EPA could use its Clean Air Act authority in certain instances. Some large part of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions come from what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, where thousands or tens of thousands of animals are pulled together. And if those are cows, that's a lot of enteric methane that they're belching out, and the manure management of usually dairy and swine releases a tremendous amount of methane. And these could be regulated under the Clean Air Act as stationary sources producing over the threshold amount of methane. However, politically, that's unlikely. So the only other alternative is what I mentioned earlier. It's the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, which pays farmers or could pay farmers to implement more of these climate-friendly practices.
Many of us city slickers are not that familiar with the Farm Bill. Can you just tell us a little bit about just what it is and what's happening with it and its relevance here?
Sure. I think of the Farm Bill as the most important environmental law most environmental lawyers have never heard of. It started in the Depression and the Dust Bowl about 100 years ago when there was concern for both food security and farm security. And those two issues have really gone together ever since. The Farm Bill is reauthorized generally about every 5 years. And one title of it is nutrition assistance. That's now called supplemental nutrition assistance. SNAP feeds about 45 million people and gets about 80% of the money from the Farm Bill. The other titles provide support in different ways to farmers, and that is about $20 billion a year of support. And some of that support comes in the form of payments based on prior plantings, really just to counter, say, a market drop in price. Some of that support comes in very heavily subsidized crop insurance. So a farmer can pay 20 or 30 cents on the dollar to get very significant insurance in case either prices go down or weather goes down. But there's also about $7 billion a year that is used in conservation programs. It's an alphabet soup of different programs, but that basically pays landowners somewhere around 75%, sometimes more, sometimes 90% or even more than that, of practices that may reduce the carbon emissions or help the farmland store more carbon. Practices I mentioned earlier, such as tilling the ground less, because when you disturb the ground, you release the carbon stored in the soil into the atmosphere. Or keeping the ground covered during the winter after you harvest the crop in, say, October or whenever. It may be bare until you plant in the spring, and that bare ground will release more carbon. So if you cover the ground with what's called a cover crop in the winter, the ground will end up storing more carbon. And or shifting perhaps to a perennial plants or adding trees to your soil, to your farmland, say around the fields or around stream buffers. All of this is supported by the Farm Bill. And that's a tremendous opportunity.
You said the principal purposes of the Farm Bill from the very beginning have been food security and farm security. So by food security, I assume you mean there's just enough food produced so that people don't go hungry. Does farm security basically mean that farms stay in operation and farmers don't go bankrupt?
That was certainly the original intent, and that is certainly a lot of the rhetoric now. As it is now, I think it is unclear whether it is preventing bankruptcy or rather keeping the system going of producing crops that may not be the crops that are most of interest to the market. For example, we have a huge amount of our cropland is devoted, as I mentioned earlier, to biofuels, which are not, of course, feeding anybody. And we have a tremendous amount of cropland devoted to animal feed, which when fed to animals, which people do eat, is actually very inefficient. For example, it takes about 15 pounds of grain to get a pound of beef. So a lot of the system is encouraging an inefficient agricultural production system.
Tracy was talking a few minutes ago about carbon capture and sequestration. Peter, you've been involved with the environmental community for many years, and there are some of the environmental community who are opposed to the idea of carbon capture and sequestration. Can you talk about that and why you see some of this opposition?
Well, I'm not following that issue closely right now, but I do know that some of the concerns, and whether it be for any type of trading system, is that you can be left with hotspots if you have the same pollution that is emitted from a number of sources, and one source reduces their emissions tremendously and another source doesn't. You are left with one of those communities that still has a lot of pollution. And of course, pollution of one sort, say a greenhouse gas pollution, very likely is accompanied by other pollution, say toxic or conventional pollutants that have more immediate and local health impacts. So I think that's always been a concern to any of these types of trading schemes or offset schemes, that you're leaving some communities behind.
Another objection I've heard, particularly from the environmental justice community, is that carbon capture and sequestration is a way for the fossil fuel industry to stay in operation for coal-fired power plants, many of which are located in disadvantaged communities that are disproportionately exposed to pollution, but it allows those facilities to stay in operation. Recently, the chair of Occidental said that they see carbon capture and sequestration as a way for the fossil fuel industry in general to continue in operation as a way of reducing its emissions. Tracy, do you have any reactions to those kinds of objections to carbon capture and sequestration?
Absolutely. They're real. Those concerns reflect reality. If you take a look at a carbon capture system, particularly one that's being installed at an existing industrial facility, from the outside fence line, it looks just like any other piece of machinery with the same sort of energy demands and same sort of chemical inputs. And as a result, you're essentially adding to infrastructure burdens on communities that have already got a pretty sizable burden already. Essentially, you're expanding the footprint of refineries and power plants. So as a result, you are once again asking communities to share the burden locally for a pollution reduction activity that benefits society at large. So it's a real environmental justice discussion. Besides this, just the footprint of these carbon capture systems, and again, talking particularly about carbon capture and sequestration in industrial facilities, there's also just making sure that it's done in a way that people feel assured that the carbon dioxide that's captured is managed safely, particularly if it's being compressed and stored in any kind of volume. We've already had at least one incident, not as part of a carbon capture system, but with a carbon dioxide pipeline release that had an impact in a local community in Louisiana. Just people want to know that it's being done in a way that's being safe and fair. And I can't resist noting, Mike, that Romany Webb at the Sabin Center has been doing some excellent work at a very high level on community benefit agreements, which help address some of those inequalities and make sure that local communities have information and, frankly, compensation to make sure that these burdens are shared fairly.
Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, a few months ago, the Sabin Center put out a report analyzing a lot of community benefit agreements and including a bunch of samples of agreements that had already been executed. So Tracy, in the overall scheme of things, what do you think should be the role that carbon capture and sequestration ought to play in addressing the climate crisis?
Well, it's important, but it's an option among a menu of a lot of things we need to be doing. First, and most importantly, and the thing we just simply can't lose sight of, carbon capture and sequestration is not a replacement for reducing emissions. That remains the key goal. It is much less efficient to have an industrial system that emits CO2 and then try and capture that CO2 and manage it and sequester it, as opposed to redesigning that system to reduce the amount it generates in the first place or even substituting a wholly different production process that has a lower or no CO2 footprint. There's a reason renewable energy is a preferred alternative to a lot of carbon-based energy sources, simply because in the long run, even if you try and make a zero carbon emission plant that burns natural gas, it's a lot easier to use wind or solar power and avoid that entire iterative step in addition to it. In addition as well, we're going to need to look at carbon capture as a part of this transition, but I think everyone acknowledges ultimately it can be an effective way to essentially keep going on a permanent basis, because essentially opportunity cost of the money that's spent to capture and sequester that CO2 is money that could be spent on some of these more effective and efficient ways to generate the same industrial products. I will say, and again, perhaps I don't want to lose focus on what the question you've asked me, Michael, but carbon capture from the ambient atmosphere, carbon dioxide removal, is a different question. And I'm certainly glad to talk about what role it plays. But for now, I just want to make sure that, even though we see some of the energy sector really making big bets on carbon capture and sequestration, at the end of the day, it's a transitional strategy. And we sort of need to keep that larger goal in mind, because frankly, we are already overshooting the 1.5 degree Celsius goal of the Paris Agreement. And we're looking increasingly certain to overshoot the 2 degree centigrade goal as well.
Yeah, there's some recent numbers that suggest we're already past 1.5 degrees. Tracy, can I just ask you to pick up on that about carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere? What role do you think it should play in climate policy going forward?
I think it plays a critical role. In the long run, a more important role than carbon capture. But the assumption that ultimately we're going to be reducing carbon emissions in the first place for lots of reasons. But even if we dropped to zero emissions, we still have to address that historical debt that's built up in our atmosphere. That accumulation of CO2 is going to stay. It's entrained in the atmosphere as well as in the oceans. Even if it's left in its current condition, it will slowly decay, but it will, in some conditions, while we may see a large initial reduction, it will linger in substantial amounts for thousands of years. So we really need to start filling in that hole, removing that CO2. And right now, frankly, carbon dioxide removal is the most important tool to do that. It could take lots of forms. It doesn't have to be industrial direct air capture with machinery. It can, as Peter's pointed out, agriculture could play a big role in this. Mining and accelerated weathering could play a big role in this. Removal of CO2 from the oceans could play a big role in this. But that overall concept of sort of dealing with the accumulations of the past is something we're going to have to make a centerpiece of future policy.
Peter, what are your thoughts on that? What role do you think that both carbon capture and sequestration and carbon dioxide removal should play in climate policy going forward?
Well, I think agriculture and trees and forest land have a big opportunity to help with carbon removal. One, the classic first rule of holes is to stop digging. And so one answer is trees are doing a great job of carbon removal right now, and yet there's deforestation going on around the planet. Much of that deforestation, particularly in tropical countries, is driven by demand for soy as cattle feed or grazing land for cattle. And so agriculture has an outsized role in, first of all, stopping deforestation and allowing the trees to continue to remove the carbon that they are currently removing. Second, as I mentioned earlier, we have a tremendous amount of agricultural land that we are using in a very inefficient, if not counterproductive way. The crop-based biofuels, such as corn ethanol and soy-based diesel, are actually worse for the climate in most instances than petroleum-based fuels. So the idea that we're using all that land for something that takes us backwards is pretty crazy, and we could use a lot of land for carbon removal. So I think there's a real opportunity to look closely at what we are using agricultural land for and rethinking what do we need. And right now, especially when we waste 40% of the food we produce, it is not that we need more food, it is that we need more carbon removal. Of course, there is still food insecurity around the world, but that's much more a question of distribution of food rather than how much the world or the U.S. is producing. So I think those are some real opportunities to both change how we're growing our food on agricultural land and very significantly think about what we're doing with our land in the first place. Right now, we make it extremely profitable for a landowner to grow corn because they're so heavily subsidized from 3 or 4 different programs. And that doesn't really make sense. We should be using public funds to support what we really need, which is carbon removal from the atmosphere. I would say one other opportunity we have is with respect to methane. Methane is a much shorter-lived greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide. So if we stop the sources of methane, we will see a climactic response much more quickly because it will leave the atmosphere within a couple decades. And so that is why both for industrial and agricultural sources, a lot more effort is being paid right now to methane reductions. You've seen the global methane pledge. Environmental groups are focusing more on methane. The Biden administration has released methane rules. But all of those really just look at industrial methane. But meanwhile, agriculture in the U.S. and in most other countries is the overall largest source of methane. So I think we have to think about much more aggressively reducing agricultural methane as well as effectively a carbon removal practice, because, as I said, it's a much shorter-lived climate pollutant.
So do you think we're moving in the right direction in trying to maximize the carbon dioxide removal potential of agriculture and reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases from agriculture?
We're moving in the right direction, but not nearly fast enough. The last time the Farm Bill was reauthorized was 2018, and at that time there was really no conversation about climate change or greenhouse gases. And indeed, the American Farm Bureau Federation, the largest lobby for industrial agricultural interests, at that time didn't even acknowledge agriculture's role in climate change or climate change. Now everybody recognizes climate change is real and agriculture contributes to it, and there are change opportunities to change agricultural practices. Very significantly, the Inflation Reduction Act passed a couple of years ago, which a lot of people focused on the provisions providing funds for clean energy and clean transportation. The Inflation Reduction Act also provided $20 billion over 4 years to go to those Farm Bill conservation programs I mentioned earlier, but only for practices that would reduce net greenhouse gas emissions. So this was the first time Congress ever acknowledged the connection between agriculture and climate change, and it was a major, major step forward. These conservation programs, I should say, are wildly popular among farmers. They want to implement these practices, but they're a change, so they also appreciate the support. But 2/3 of the farmers that apply to these practices, apply for support for these practices, are turned away because there isn't enough money. So this Inflation Reduction Act support was really, really important. And right now, the Farm Bill is up for reauthorization again. And one of the biggest debates in Congress will be whether or not it will continue to provide that type of significant support to farmers for implementing climate-friendly practices. The Senate bill would continue that and enlarge that support. The House bill would cut it off and reduce it. And hopefully we'll get a good answer relatively soon.
And by the time people listen to this podcast, we may have more information on how that's playing out in Congress.
Almost certainly. The House markup is Thursday, so we'll know more one way or the other pretty soon.
Thursday, May 23rd, right?
That's correct.
So the book came out shortly after the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act, and we did include some discussion of the Inflation Reduction Act in the book. Are there more recent developments that have happened, Tracy, that are especially relevant to the issues you've been talking about?
Well, sure. I think probably the one I've already previously mentioned, which was the passage of the new regulations that were going to be addressing existing coal-fired power plants and new gas-fired power plants for CO2 emissions. That's a big deal. As our listeners probably know, this has been one of the biggest regulatory tug-of-wars between EPA and Congress and the Supreme Court, going back to the Obama power plant. So the fact that we've got those regs in place and hopefully at this point designed to withstand major questions challenge is a major development. Beyond that, though, the Inflation Reduction Act has really been a catalyst for a lot of activity. That again, it's not necessarily terribly visible because the technology is still relatively nascent. But I just can say that we've seen a lot of activity along the Gulf Coast to identify where future sequestration facilities can be built. We've seen proposals for hubs to create both CO2 collection and sequestration, particularly including a $100 billion proposal that's being spearheaded by Exxon. And I can also say that I've seen a lot of quiet activity to essentially lock up geologic space available along the coast, both on land and offshore, that would be used in the future for sequestration purposes. So essentially the pieces are being laid in place for future expansion. That's all a very big change. And in the past, a lot of this sequestration discussion has been theoretical, frankly. We're starting to see sizable investments and bets being made by some of the energy majors that sort of point a pathway that will actually become more widely deployed in the future.
Peter, are there any new or forthcoming developments in your area that you'd like to mention?
Well, other than the Farm Bill being reauthorized in its shape, which will be enormously important, nothing enormous other than the Inflation Reduction Act. But I want to reemphasize how important that was, as the first time Congress linked agriculture and climate change. For those in the energy sector, climate and energy issues have been linked for a long time, but this is really a sea change. And that's bringing with it a lot more attention. That is getting some of the states to get more involved, to thinking about how they can use some of their programs to encourage climate-friendly practices in farms in their own states. It's changing the shape of research a little bit. Most of what we know right now about climate-friendly practices are really the result of some landowners and farmers doing what they thought was right and finding it to work. And they were doing it because they thought it was the right thing to do. And we have put very little research into that. And overall, agricultural research has gone down. But until recently, research into climate-friendly practices has been really quite modest. So that has been really changing the idea that we really all should be looking closely at what can be done to reduce the climate impact of agriculture. And this administration has used some of their existing authorities to try to make that happen even faster. They use their authority under what's called the Commodity Credit Corporation to support the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. And through that, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has funded about $3.2 billion of projects to help really producers of all sorts of agricultural commodities develop and implement more climate-friendly approaches. And what's good is that many of these projects, I should say, include a university because we need a lot of study, a lot of monitoring, a lot better understanding of what practices do and how long they work and how much carbon they sequester, how much greenhouse gases they can reduce. We know a lot less than we do in the energy area. So that Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities should be a good step in the right direction as well, encouraging a lot more study of these practices. So you've got the Inflation Reduction Act, you've got the Climate Smart Commodities, you've got the increase of research, you've got the increase of state-level activity, and as I mentioned earlier, you have the private sector becoming more interested, and I think very importantly, consumers willing to pay for it. Studies repeatedly show that consumers are willing to pay more for climate-friendly foods. They want to buy foods that are consistent with their values. And that's going to be a really important aspect as well to help shape the market.
Well, we've reached the end of our time. I want to thank Peter Lehner from Earthjustice and Tracy Hester from the University of Houston Law Center. This is Michael Gerrard from Columbia Law School. This is the end of this episode of our discussion of the ABA book, Global Climate Change and U.S. Law, 3rd edition. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. To learn more about our section, please visit our website at americanbar.org/enviro. Please check where you found us for future episodes. Thank you for listening.